You're one of Canada's preeminent religious scholars and spent virtually entire adult life analyzing, teaching, writing about the biblical scriptures.
The Gospels, whose dating is not quite as precise as people would lead us to believe, and only really come together fully about 150 Common Era. But their origins, the tradition is believed to have come out of the 1st century. I'm interested in evidence. If it's going to be history, let's have evidence. The funny thing was, Alan, the farther the church got away from the supposed time of Jesus' life, the more sure it became of what went on. The closer it got to that supposed time, the more vague it became. That's the very reverse of what happens with any truly historical person.
Well, I want to get into evidence, but first you've called your book The Pagan Christ.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, this is partially to still continue the answer to your original question. I, at this point, about 3 years ago, was sent by a chap whom I didn't know, but who was a United Church clergyman, some material. He said, I think you should look at this material. And when I started to read it, I realized I was looking at a payload of fact, of evidence that I'd never seen in my life before. And as I examined this, at first I thought it can't be, and as I went on, I realized cumulatively it was. And it was proof that prior to the 3rd or 4th centuries, Christianity had been very different from the way it was after Constantine, the Council of Nicaea, and the 4th century, that a big change had taken place. And that's what struck me. When I saw that that had happened, and the way in which they were prepared to kill, to burn books, to destroy the evidence of it having happened, that I realized something untoward was really at work here.
Well, let's give our viewers some sense of the similarities, because you go through this evidence and you say, well, here's the New Testament. I mean, that virtually everything that Jesus was reported to have done in the Gospels, from the Sermon on the Mount to crucifixion, was told in ancient Egyptian religious writing. Give us some examples there of the same kind of stories that were being told 4 or 5 centuries earlier.
Oh, more than that, even thousands of years earlier. Yeah, this was my astonishment. When I read for the first time, Alan, a story that had always, I used to be a professor of New Testament, a story that had always been problematic for me, the raising of Lazarus, which is in the 4th Gospel, and it's the most dramatic miracle that Jesus is supposed to have carried out. He raised a man from the dead who had been dead 4 days. He was really dead. When I came across that story, in all its full details, in an Egyptian dress and an Egyptian setting, right down to Martha and Mary and to the coming forth out of the tomb, in every detail, in 1700, before the Common Era, 17 centuries earlier, I realized I was onto foreshadowing. When you get down to 180 exact parallels found between Horace and Jesus, 180 exact parallels, where he's saying, I am the bread of life. This is Horace. Or what the evangelicals keep throwing at me. Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life. So how are you going to get around that one, brother? And I said, well, have a look at this, 2,000 years earlier. I am the way, the truth, and the life being said. I mean, it is so precise and so exact. I can't, it blows you away.
I mentioned about the rise of Christianity in Egypt. And Saint Shenouda has one of the most powerful moments in our destruction of the ancient Egyptian language. He was a powerful monk in the middle of Egypt, in an area today called the Sohag Governorate. And he ruled over an area called the White Monastery. And he was extremely, extremely powerful. He was a learned man, traveled widely. But he was also very intolerant of pagan religions. And he writes, hieroglyphs were prescriptions for murdering man's soul that are therein, written with blood and not ink alone. There should be nothing else portrayed for them except the likeness of animals. And during his reign as the head monk at the White Monastery, he sent his monks out into the countryside to erase the glyphs, to close the temples. He organized lynch mobs and small groups of people in order to beat God into these native Egyptians. He both gave education and suppressed education inside Egypt. And by 415, the last wealthy pagan woman, Hypatia, was lynched in Thebes. And with her lynching, the untouchable pagans at the top of society suddenly were no longer untouchable. Gods reading the native language had become so dangerous. And those people were under such persecution that it was not ever worshipped in the open.
It blows you away.
In 1707, there was a scholar at Oxford named John Mill, unrelated to John Stuart Mill, the Victorian that some of you know about. This John Mill was a textual scholar of the New Testament. He spent 30 years of his life studying the manuscripts of the New Testament. He had access to about 100 manuscripts of the New Testament, and he studied them thoroughly, and then he put together a book. He called it the Novum Testamentum Graeci, the Greek New Testament of John Mill in 1707. And what he did in this Greek New Testament is he printed a line or two of the Greek verses from the New Testament, Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, verse 2, verse 3. But then at the bottom of the page, he listed places where the manuscript had differences for every verse. To the shock and dismay of his readers, John Mill's Greek New Testament listed 30,000 places where the manuscripts disagreed with one another. 30,000 places of variation among the manuscripts. Now, some of his detractors were quite upset by this and claimed that John Mill had published his Novum Testament Graeci in order to render the text of the New Testament uncertain. They thought this was some kind of demonic plot on the part of a university professor. But his supporters pointed out he hadn't actually invented these 30,000 places of variation. He just noticed that they exist, as they do exist in our manuscripts. Well, that was 300 years ago, based on a study of 100 manuscripts. Now we have over 5,500 manuscripts, which have been studied quite assiduously by scholars, although they have not been thoroughly studied yet. What can we say about the number of variations today among our manuscripts of the New Testament? The reality is we don't know how many changes scribes made in their texts of the New Testament. We don't know because nobody has been able to add up all the numbers yet. Even with the development of computer technology, we don't know how many differences there are. There are scholars who will tell you that there are 300,000 differences, scholars who will tell you there are 400,000 differences. People will come up with all sorts of numbers, but the reality is we don't know. We can put it in relative terms. There are more differences in our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. Well, that's a lot of differences. Probably several 100,000.